that says brilliant. We're recording, people. I'm just going to do a little intro and then we are going to rock and roll. So give me 1 second to work out where the share screen button is. Do like 5 of these a week. You think I'd remember it? Cool. Veronica, can you just confirm that you can see my screen? Because I can see that you joined.
Yes, I can.
Cool. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Happiness Index is the pursuit, I can never even say the title, the pursuit of vulnerability, how men can form meaningful relationships at work. We've never done an event specifically with men in the title. We work so hard to create diverse panels, diverse subjects, but we really, in Mental Health Week, want to focus on men today. As we know, the suicide for men in the UK is horrific, and we want to take a bit of time out today to discuss this subject. So the Happiness Index is an employee engagement and happiness platform. In 2 seconds, if you want to understand how your people feel and put emotions back into employee engagement, go to www.thehappinessindex.com and get a demo. The team will do an amazing job of walking you through it. This week for Mental Health Week, we've released a new mental health survey. So if you really want to understand how your people are feeling on that very important subject, there's a survey within the platform that does that. But I'm going to take these slides down, Lewis, because they are just slides and we've got the real people here. So let me hit stop share. So I want to introduce Lewis by saying we were really both really lucky to do a TED talk in Brighton recently, and it's I'm not just saying this to be nice. Like Lewis's talk came with so much intensity, and it stopped so many people, including myself in the room, to stop and think about a lot of stuff in their past, a lot of stuff about them now, and a lot of stuff in the future. And probably one of my favourite stories about me and Lewis meeting is a story about in the toilets in Brighton, Lewis, which it was a fascinating moment where after we'd both done our talks, we went to the toilet and someone approached Lewis that had been fundamentally impacted in a positive way by what Lewis is talking about, and really encouraged him to continue getting this message out. So Kashi, our community lead, I'm just admitting some more people into the room. Welcome, new people. Kashi was like, we need to get Lewis on and spread Lewis's message on these subjects. So that's how I got to know Lewis. And I'm Matt Phelan. I'm co-founder of the Happiness Index, and I'm going to be interviewing Lewis today. So Lewis, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, firstly, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to share messages and share experiences in new spaces. So a little bit about myself. I am an academic. I am based down in the University of the West of England, currently one of the youngest lecturers in the UK. I can only use that for another year or so, but I'm 24. I've been teaching for 2 years and have been teaching in various different disciplines, but I am a mental health professional alongside this work. So I work with young people, specifically young men, for the most part, when it comes to their masculinity and giving them space to contact, explore, and express their magnificence in whatever form that is, and whatever that means to them, I suppose. So I think for me, my work in all the different facets of, I suppose, areas that I'm involved in is all about challenging structure, taking for granted ideas and assumptions and flipping them on their head entirely. And over the last year and a half, masculinity has been my focus. Not just masculinity by itself, but the intersections with various different social identities. And that's what you saw for those who were there at TedXBrighton, was a manifestation of that work through part monologue, part sort of rant, but it was one of those moments that really brought together all of that work and observation over the last few years. And I'm still, creating and producing with that in mind. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. Pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to get speaking, man.
Lewis, before we get sort of stuck into the subject, I'd love to know, why do you do what you do? Because you could have an easier life not getting stuck into these serious subjects. Like, Like, what is it that makes you want to get so deep into this session and come and talk to all these people that have signed up today?
I think it's what I say to people that ask me that is, awareness of ideas kind of gives you a choice. When you're aware of things, so whether that's masculinity, race, gender identity, disability, and you're aware of these concepts and how these concepts impact, and not just impact others, but also yourself as well. And you kind of see yourself as a potential contributor or perpetuator of some of these negative experiences. You have a choice in that moment. And for some people, it's acknowledge and kind of stay back. For others, it's an acknowledge and try and work through so that you can help others to work through. And I think I fall into that camp. I think working with young people and seeing how these systemic issues and these systemic narratives impact very young people and impact them across their lifetime, that for me is enough drive for me to be in those spaces and to make sure that what reaches them is something that can steer them in a different direction or give them something entirely new to consider and think about, and to give them that safety to be themselves. So I think that's why I do what I do. It's that fundamentally the desire to be of service and of use, but also to undo a lot of poor learnings that we all experience throughout our lives. And you can't go back in time and change what you learn, but you can pay it forward with the people that you interact with and what you tell them. So that's why I do that element of the work that I'm involved in.
I love it, Lewis. And you told a story when we were in Brighton about some of your students. And like, obviously, there's a lot of people here. I can see in the list, we've got some CEOs, we've got HR directors, and there's a saying in business around like culture is about like a good culture is about not tolerating like the poor behavior and so on. I can't remember the saying. I'm struggling to remember it, but someone will type it in the box in a minute. But you told us a story about in your school about the students identifying some behavior that they wouldn't accept because of some of the conversations you've been having as a group. Can you just share that story with us? Because I think it's such a powerful story.
Sure. So there's a context within my mental health where I go into various different schools within the city of Bristol, where I'm from, and deliver these masculinity sessions. And within this particular story example, I was working with a year 9 group. We had not long, well, I think we kind of like maybe coming towards the end or not long finished, but we'd been having these conversations around patriarchy, misogyny, what this looks like for us, but also for other people. And there was a situation where some young people from another school walking past the school at the end of the day, and were kind of catcalling some of the female teachers. And the group of young people, some of the group of young people that I was working with, kind of took them to the side. They knew them. They knew, not like friends, but knew them, and kind of took them to the side and explained that doesn't run around here. That's not the behavior that we tolerate, and here's why. So, I was hearing back from other members of staff, like they were talking about patriarchy and misogyny as like 13, 14-year-olds to each other. And that for me was a really pertinent example of you can communicate very complex ideas like patriarchy, misogyny, and this sort of systemic experience of it to young people. Young people can understand that and explain that on to others, and that is like an example of the beginning of a culture shift. And for me, that's a very, very important story that I draw on when talking about but they're complex things to talk about patriarchy and misogyny. These changes, they can't really. It's a long-term effort, yes, but also in examples like this, it's once it's accessible and able to be kind of internalized from the experience of the person, you can produce changes or examples of change like what I've just described.
Yeah, no, it's such a powerful story, Lewis. And the next bit, I'll just sort of read it out as we wrote it down, but unpicking internalized toxic masculine ideals and how to begin dismantling the societal expectations of men. In terms of the people that came to listen Lewis in Brighton. My son came he's 5, so a bit younger than your normal lot, and I asked him what he thought of what you said, and I tried to get a summary out of him, because there's words in here that even I'm still struggling to understand myself, and his interpretation of your talk was that people need to be nicer to each other. So that's the 5-year-old but we'd love to get into some of these things around unpicking internalized toxic masculine ideals. Can we just start with that bit? Like what does that mean?
Sure. I mean, it's a multi-directional, multifaceted, approach. So take what I say as one or two interpretations of this particular, I suppose, concept and idea. But for me, the toxic masculine ideals are beliefs and behaviors that compound over time, that really impact the way in which we view ourselves as men or as masculine entities, and impact the way in which we interact with each other and those around us too. So the unpicking of toxic masculine ideals is about looking at what you define as masculine, for example. What things for you feed into this conceptualization of you as a man? And of these things, how many of these ideas are serving you and how many of them are harming you? Because, I like to give the example of, it's about being a provider. It's about, being the person in control. A lot of our young people say this, for example. Like, we need to be the person that runs the house and runs the family and et cetera, et cetera. But is that something that fills you with a sense of joy, happiness, or does it stress you out? Because if you're the only person, for example, doing this, or what have you got to do to make sure that role's fulfilled? How much of yourself are you having to ignore and put to the side emotionally, spiritually? How much of that is being pushed over in pursuit of this ideal? Who gave you this ideal? Where does that come from? And I think that is what I mean by unpicking the toxic masculine ideal. It's actually trying to trace the source of it. Where does it come from? Is this my thought, or is it somebody else's thought that I've had to take on to survive in this space that we live in? So there's a fascinating concept called Gore capitalism. I'm reading it currently, revisiting it, and it's just an amazing theory, and it's an amazing idea, linking masculinity to capitalism, and this idea that masculinity, the way to keep capitalism alive is to ultimately kill our men. Isn't literally kill them, but to kill them away from their emotional, the sense of emotion, the sense of personal self, their sense of, idea of fulfillment and who they want to be, so that they become the agents of the capitalist system, working, providing at the system's expense as opposed to their own. For those who watch the TED Talk, and spoiler alert, we may see it when it comes out, but the first line is, I meet with death a few times a week, right? That doesn't mean that I'm seeing dead people a few times a week. It means I see men that are disconnected from their lives. They're not living a life for themselves. They're living a lifeless, meaningless experience that's disconnected from what they want to be in exchange for who they think they must be. That's what I mean by unpicking those toxic masculine ideals. How much of your idea of you is yours, and how much of it is something else? And learning that and going through that process is difficult at times, but it is a necessary learning experience, because it empowers you then to take control of who you are or who you want to be, and leave some of those ideas behind in that pursuit of you ultimately.
It was it's interesting. I'll just share a story on that maybe other people might want to share when we get towards the end, which is, for me, personally, one of the examples of that was alcohol, which is I've done like a 3-year process of giving up alcohol, but because I decided to measure whether alcohol makes me happy or not, which sounds like a stupid thing to do, but I've now given up alcohol, and I don't think I'll drink again. But one of the things that people say, what people say to you when you don't drink, and they can be friends, they can be family members, they can be people that you respect, but they say, be a man, have a drink, be a man. That's what I get told, even though I've done my own analysis, I've done my own research. I believe that I'm a happier, better person for not drinking. And the irony is apparently if you don't drink, your testosterone levels are higher. So it's kind of like factually incorrect from that perspective anyway. So would you say that is an example of unpicking something, Lewis, or is that a slightly different area?
Absolutely. Like the process of, I suppose another way of framing unpicking toxic masculine ideals is just engaging in that process of critical thinking. It's that the idea of, what is this true? Do I believe this to be true? Like, where's the evidence for these ideas? With your example, that's great, because I think every person, and then men, women, people who identify as sort of non-binary, gender identity or experiences across, the lived experience of human beings, there are things that we do because it's a habit. It's a habit that we go through, and these beliefs and these processes are things that aren't attached to us. But we never critically analyze those behaviors or ideas because it's just something that's expected. So I think absolutely, this idea of men drinking, or real men having a drink. I don't really drink too much. I mean, I drink every now and again, but I would be in the same boat as you. I feel pretty masculine of myself right now without the presence of a beverage or anything else. And I think that critical thinking allows you that individualization of your masculinity, which goes back to what we've been talking about before, is finding your version and your truth and sticking to that. So absolutely.
Yeah. And in terms of like the second bit that we've got here in the sentence about dismantling these expectations, because that's like a big, if you take alcohol as an example, I don't know how many billions of pounds are spent on advertising alcohol to all of us in particular ways a year, but there's a lot of money against someone who is trying to do that. There's a lot of stuff, societal expectations. I don't want to just talk about alcohol because that's only one of the things here, but where do we start, Lewis, if we want to, I suppose, dismantle as a society, but also we've got a lot of HR people here. Any tips on how we do this in organizations?
Sure. I think maybe the simplest ways of conceptualizing it is a culture, whether that is at a societal level, an organizational level, or a collection of human beings united by a common goal, objective, idea, right? Within those collective identity lives several individual identities and ideas of the world, ideas of experience, etc. Change or dismantling or challenging or abolishing, however you want to utilize the terminology, is an individual endeavor. It starts at an individual level. So a lot of the time there's this question of how do we change a structure and how do we get the structures changed quickly? That's a question that will always end with small change but not sustainable change. I think real dismantling comes from looking at yourself as a person that's internalized these cultural ideas, these expectations, and engaging in a collective exploration of what makes us us, and then feeding back and conversating with each other in our cultures, in our organizations, in our community groups, wherever that may be, and sharing these learnings and finding someone that can help us on our particular stumbling block, or conversing with people that we may not necessarily agree with, but to try and find and accommodate those truths and ideas. Because I feel like change at any level starts here, and the change that is sustainable also starts here. Because anything that isn't from you, from a place of authentic learning and authentic truth, is susceptible to, other like dominant cultural narratives coming in and taking over, right? To know yourself is to know the culture that you exist within. And as you get to know yourself, you may think, right, this culture doesn't serve me. This space doesn't serve me. Am I going to stay, or am I going to leave, or am I going to change, or am I going to challenge? That for me is where this dismantling comes from. Looking at ourselves as a microcosm of the wider like socio-political sphere, if you want to get really like sort of like meta in a sense, but looking at us as that microcosm of culture, and really looking at ourselves with the same intensity that we would, an organizational structure. How can we make this more flat, or how can we do this, or where can we put this? Like looking at ourselves with that same level of intensity and curiosity, because there's a lot of stuff in us that we don't explore or critique, because we just kind of we offload it into the spaces that we're in not recognizing that these spaces are reflective of what we think of ourselves, if that makes sense.
Wow, we're getting deep, but it does. But that's what we want to do. What if, right, Lewis, you do that, and what you find scares you? Because there must be with the introspection that must happen. Like you may question stuff, but you may feel fear at this point. Any tips on what men that are listening can do that introspect and what they discover about themselves fears them? Any advice? Any advice on that?
Absolutely. I'm scared every day that I do the introspection work. And I would be doing everybody a disservice if I said that, there isn't an element of fear that follows. It's the same with, the anti-racist work that we do. It's the same thing with exploring our ideas of masculinity. When we look within, we will find ideas that are our ideas, but they don't see them as part of us, but they are part of us. And there's that moment of realization of, okay, I don't like this, but this is part of me. But it's also about looking at these ideas and these beliefs, not as a reflection of you as a person, but a reflection of the spaces and people and environments that you've grown up within. These things are, may not have been in our immediate control at those points in time, but it's to look at those moments of fear and sort of like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I had that in me to think that way, but looking at that with a angle of love as opposed to, oh my gosh, I can't look at that. It's to be, okay, how would you talk to a younger version of yourself? So take the example, I would do this. I would say, is that belief I have representative of the 24-year-old Lewis, or is it the 15-year-old Lewis there? Is it the 12-year-old Lewis there? Is it the 18-year-old Lewis there? How would I approach this version of me differently? And how would I heal that in that interaction if he was sat opposite me? Doing that, it's scary, but it also allows you to nourish that and heal some of those ideas that you may not want to hold on to, but close that learning experience with love, as opposed to, I can't believe that I want to shut that away. In order to heal, we have to acknowledge from that position of love, which is, a key tenet of therapy, but it is also a key tenet of life as well. We're not the same people we were 5-10 years ago, and that's okay, but we still hold on to things that we may have thought 5-10 years ago that we have to release with that love and respect.
I think, one area that I can reflect on that was coming out of the pandemic. My daughter was experiencing quite bad anxiety, and someone reached out to me to say that she could help and coach her. But my first instinct was a bit like, oh, if I get my daughter to a coach, that's a bit weird, and also like, will that feed it? But then exactly as you said, Lewis, I was like, no, that's just the old me that would think like that. The new me would think that's a great idea. And I had to talk to myself in my head. And then this person did help my daughter, and it really helped her with her anxiety to the point where she helps her brother now. So, but I had to have that chat in my head. I was like, that's the old me. That's the old me that would think like that, not the person that's been lucky enough to meet all these amazing HR people around the world and learning from them and interviewing people like you. So, do you is that a thing? Do you talk to yourself in your head? Because I read this thing the other day that one of the things we're taught, like when we grow up, is to ignore if you have a voice in your head that you're crazy, when actually we all have a voice in our head and it's really powerful. We need to talk to it. Do you do that, Lewis?
I do. I also hold journals as well. That I said this in an interview maybe a couple of years ago. Something that I found when I went to therapy for the first time was holding a journal of all of my inner children. So I talk to myself in moments of anxiety, fear, and I know from recording the experiences of how I feel, I'm moving like this today, I feel this way. This is probably a 10-year-old me. The 10-year-old isn't happy. I need to go and speak with him. I need to let him know things are okay. Like, you're going to be all right. Like, no problem. Like, it's okay for you to feel this way. But in order for us to move on, we're going to need to hold this like with love and let it go until next time. And I have this journal that I very regularly look at and go to when I feel like I'm a bit disconnected. I don't feel like it's myself. I know the inner child is running the show a little bit, and I will then go, okay, 15-year-old today needs to feel validated. He's not feeling seen enough or whatever. Okay, cool. How am I going to do that through my work? And how am I going to do this? Like, for me, the TED Talk was a huge inner child healing moment for a 15-year-old me that wanted to say so much at times, but didn't know quite what he was saying, or he wanted to be seen and kind of looked at, so to speak, but didn't know what, not what he was good at, but he hadn't found that avenue, that passion yet. So that was a hugely powerful healing moment for a 15-year-old version of me. But that knowledge and that understanding comes from, like you said, that self-talk and recognizing the difference between, who's running the show, because I feel like it's something that's maybe touched upon more in therapeutic circles, but we're not a single self. We're not just a 24-year-old or a 30-year-old or a 45-year-old person. We are the combination of all of the years of experiences, and at times different parts of us take over. So having that self-talk and recognizing the way in which we behave and why we behave in certain ways is absolutely essential. And I talk to myself very often.
Yeah, no, that's good. That gives everyone here that confidence that we can do that, and that is totally normal. And actually, we need to. So thank you, Lewis.
No problem.
The next bit is why we sort of got the demand to do this together, this sort of live webinar, because the next question is where kind of both our TED Talks kind of connected, but we'd never met each other before. And so I was talking from a data perspective, but then you were sort of giving insight, which is we basically realized in our data, for those that haven't seen it, which we've known for a while, that the number one driver of employee happiness is relationships. But we also know that you can't form meaningful relationships without sharing emotions. But at work, we're told that we shouldn't be emotional. So that's kind of what I was talking about. And then you're later on in the day, and you're talking about, which I'll just read out, how being vulnerable, expressing emotions, admitting to things such as loneliness can help form meaningful relationships in the workplace. Now, that was like, a lot of people were like, oh, did you and Lewis plan that? Was that like a segue through or whatever? And we didn't. But so I just love you to, because there's a few of our clients on here, they'll be working on these programs on how they get people to share more emotions at work. Any tips on how people can get better at that?
Sure. I mean, it goes kind of back to what I was saying about the encouraging self-work firstly. So I'll give an example of kind of what we do as a team of mental health practitioners as well. We engage very regularly in like our own self-exploration, whether that's reading, whether that's journal work, whether that's therapeutic work. But we often come together as well to share and talk about those experiences and what we've learned. So Wednesday, for example, we did a theatre of the oppressed team building exercise, right? So it's where you basically do theatre, like you go in and you embody characters, but these characters are reflective. What we found out afterwards, these characters are reflective of your inner thoughts and ideas in relation to the work that you're doing in the workplace. And I was, at one point I was like stretched, as in like in a big sort of like stretched position. And like that for me, that made me start like almost like pulling tears, because it had been a very busy week. And I had no idea that that's what I was doing, but it was true. And engaging in that space with my team, we were able to have that conversation of, okay, what can we do to support that? Like, are you feeling stretched? Okay, that's fine. I'm feeling stretched too. How are we going to work on this and communicate that? What do you need from us, and what do we need from you? And how can we kind of heal this together collectively? And encouraging that openness and that expression through those like team bonding exercises, where talking about emotions and ideas are normalized and really encouraged, is a way to develop that culture of openness and authenticity. Granted, we all are a team of therapists, right? Or we do mental health work, so we're able to hold that space a little bit easier. But it can be something as simple as a book club. We're talking about masculinity, for example, where you've got a read on masculinity. You come together maybe once a week, a couple times a month. What did you learn about this? What made you feel that way? Did that stir up any emotions in you? Why was that the case? I know it was this case for me. And having that dialogue and having those discussions where you're gradually pricking the surface of the emotional work that you're doing, but normalizing that within the workspace and making that a priority within the workplace. Because happiness and feeling satisfied within the work that we do is very much related to how satisfied we feel within ourselves and how we can express that and how we can communicate that. So that's an example of how that can be done. Or within your organizational spaces, people on here that are running those elements of their business or their practice know their workforce better. It's about finding that way to cultivate that emotional expression, but making that a sustainable, consistent thing. It's not just once or twice, a week in line with like Mental Health Awareness Week. It's embedded in the company culture or the structural culture to make that time to have those moments, to feel those ways, and to articulate that and to share that and have those moments of connection. I think that's the way to go forward with that.
Wow, Lewis. For those that are listening, as we go into sort of the last 15 minutes, if you type any questions you've got for Lewis now, I've got a couple more questions for Lewis, but then I will read people's questions out. So if as we're going along, you've thought of anything, just pop it in the chat and then we'll get back to it. We'll try and say 5 to 10 minutes at the end so we can get people's questions to Lewis. Lewis, in terms of that point, there was an interesting point yesterday. I was on stage with Monique, who's one of our customers from Fuller's Brewery. And she was discussing openly when we started working with them in October, they had a lot of unhappy staff. And what was fascinating, right? When they presented their data to the board, and Monique talked about this openly, so I'm just sharing something that's open, is when we shared their emotional data for the first time, their board sat in silence for about 10 to 15 minutes. And the reason I want to share this story with everyone, to link it in with Lewis's point about emotions, there's pages and pages of data, there's loads of conversations going on, but there was one piece of verbatim comment from one of their employees, who they don't know who it is, who was basically saying because of their work life balance, they couldn't see their children and they couldn't put their children to bed. And I thought that was such a powerful point on emotions, because people push emotions out of business to say they're not relevant in the boardroom. They're supposed to be about numbers, stats. But by the end of that board meeting, right, you can't go through a change curve without emotions. You need to feel the emotion. So if they hadn't have kept that verbatim comment in there wouldn't have been the anger in the room to do something about it, because basically everyone who was on that board took that seriously. They suddenly thought, we are stopping parents from seeing their kids. So I just wanted to share with everyone like the impact of emotions being shared in a macro way, like through data, but also through stories. Like I honestly believe that the actions wouldn't have been taken as seriously if there hadn't been an emotional story that was shared. And obviously that was done in an anonymous way. So any reflection points on that at all, Lewis, before we go on to does that resonate with you at all?
No, 100%. And to link that, obviously organizational structures aren't gendered, but this idea of running business or, enterprise or running companies is very closely linked to the idea of capitalism, which is very generationally hyper masculine. And these ideas of not looking at emotion and trying to be as sort of efficient as possible, trying to, work through and continue to kind of hit targets and ideas, puts a lot of companies in a very sort of in a very precarious position, because it is like you said, that is a representation of a structure prioritizing the goals of an organization over the individual experiences of the people that make up that space. And that acknowledgement is like, okay, we need to change something within our structure. And that in their own way, it is kind of acknowledging, not like vocalizing, this is a hyper-masculine workspace, 3 years of capitalism, capital reinforcement. It's not that, but it's the same conclusion. We need to change something about this, because right now we are not serving the people that we're trying to serve the most, and we want to serve the most, the people that we care about. And that is a direct link to most, I don't want to say most men, but most men I've worked with, their conceptualization of masculinity. I'm hurting the people that I want to love the most by how I'm presenting and how I'm being. And I need to change something about that. And I want to change something about that. So it's a very similar parallel. And I think, I'm very happy that, that learning was established, although it will be very painful, I can imagine, to be presented with that. But without that acknowledgement, there cannot be growth. So, yeah.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because even when we talked about the alcohol example, the data being the opposite, it's similar with productivity, which is the next piece, which is, again, it's the saying that I always hate, which is if you can measure it, you can manage it. And it sounds great, doesn't it? But the more and more I've looked at our data and the more we study this, I think it's just so inaccurate, because you can't measure emotions. You can feel them, but you can't measure them. And what we're really talking about here is that we see in happier workforces higher productivity. So the irony is, by trying to like reinforce this model, you actually make the workforce less productive. So somewhere along the line, I suppose it goes back to your first point, Lewis, which is we're all taught these ways of doing things about being a man, being a woman, being a CEO, being a company director, and we've got to really question, where has this stuff come from, and is it relevant today?
Absolutely, 100%, absolutely. And I think it is a process like race and anti-racist work, which I'm also very keen on as a person of color myself. It's coming to a point in our culture, in our society, that these things that we've tried to push off and not acknowledge, are coming to a point where we have to acknowledge, like I said at the start, the awareness gives us a choice. And as we become more aware, and as we learn and explore more, we have a choice: continue in the way that, or in the manner that we've always worked, or adapt in order to move with the times. And I feel like masculinity in particular, and masculinity within the workplace, is at that point. It's like, how can we continue to expect and push this particular narrative of work onto our people within the workspace, and expect them to continue to push out work when we know from XYZ article, theory, this is not helping, this is not going the way that it should be. So with that awareness comes choice. And I feel like we're at that intersection now at this point in history where a lot of people are having to make those choices within those organizations, and where you make whatever direction you make that choice solidifies the fate of your organization moving into the long future. That's what I believe anyway.
Lewis, I just want to go on to the next generation, because obviously you work with the next generation. Hopefully we'll be employing lots of people from the next generation and so on. I was in a sort of a FTSE 100 HR directors meetup a little while back, and one of the HR directors turned to me and said, "Yeah, it's all great, Matt, but when's the new generation just going to get on with it and do some work?" And my answer was, they're not. As in, they are going to do some work, but it's you that needs to adapt, not them. Millennials were just like massively derided for turning up and asking these crazy questions like, what's the purpose of the organization? Maybe we could stop wrecking the planet. Some pretty basic questions, in my opinion. Some of the subjects you are discussing on race, on gender identity, and we've touched on some of these areas. Companies need to be getting, from what I am hearing and what I am taking from this call, is companies need to be ready to have these conversations, because is it year 9? So let's take year 9s, right? If they're year 9s and they're having conversations with their with this Lewis Wedlock guy, by the time they get to the workforce, they could have been having these conversations for 6-7 years, be highly qualified and articulate in these conversations around gender identity. What I'm taking from this is companies need to be prepared to have these conversations and not be uncomfortable in these conversations. Any advice on how organizations to prepare themselves, Lewis? So, they're going to struggle to recruit these up and coming superstars?
It's a very good question, and I think I'll answer it in 2 parts. I think the first part is, like with any change that may be against what you believe or accept to be like the most representative or accurate way of doing things, to welcome it with love. Because whether you welcome it with hate or love, it's coming. And I don't mean that from a sort of like leader of the pack sort of thing. I don't mean that at all. But what I will say is, working with young people from age 12 all the way up to 19, 20, these young people are without a doubt some of the most socio-politically technical minds I've ever worked with. And I work in universities with professors of sociology and psychology. Their assessment of culture and ideas and identity at their young age is phenomenal to me. And what that lets me know is that these young people will have so much to say when it comes to the time that they're employed, or when they start their own projects, and when they bring things off of the ground. So it's about, again, looking at the typical ideas of the workforce and saying, okay, this typical way of managing is we do it this way and that way. Also recognizing that no matter how much work that you do, and it can be great work and it can be amazing work that you do to understand the structure and the ideas of race, patriarchy, misogyny, but someone with lived experience of that no matter how much books you read, no matter how much work you do, they're going to know more. They're going to know it at a deeper level, and you have to be able to welcome and accept that. Because again, this generation is what I call a no holds barred, in a sense that they have no issues with taking you online. They have no issues with letting people know what they feel. So it's about recognizing that it may be scary for you to be around these ideas and these thought processes, but these are human beings that want to succeed and want to do well in life and want to be seen and validated. So when you look at it like that, why wouldn't you welcome them with open arms and learn from them and be guided by their expertise and their wisdom? Your company is going to benefit from it. Your workforce is going to benefit from it. The people in that are going to feel listened and represented and valued too, valued as people. So that's the advice I'd give. Welcome with open arms and recognize that these young people are incredible, and they will shape, if they're given the platform to do it and they're given the trust to do it, they will shape culture and organizational structures and political structures for a very long time. They just have to be given that space to express that magnificence.
Yeah.
To let them do it.
I love it, Lewis. And we mentioned the suicide rate at the beginning, and it is tough to hear. And so I'm just letting people know that I'm going to read out the stats in case it is triggering. But it's Mental Health Week, and we decided to dedicate some time to men's health thanks to having Lewis along. But the male suicide rate was 2020. The male suicide rate was 16 and a half men within 100,000. For women, it's 4.3. So there's so many subjects that we have talked about today, but that really, for me, brings the stark reality of what we think that men are gaining from these things. It's horrific what's happening behind the scenes. So I think that again, there's another saying, isn't it, that we're not going to sort gender equality out until we sort the men out as well. So I think there's so much work that needs to be done across this whole piece. But Lewis, you've been incredible today. I've learned so much. Does anyone have any questions that they want? I haven't seen anyone pop anything in there, but if anyone does want to unmute themselves, I know it's quite a deep subject, so I'm not expecting as many questions as usual, but does anyone have any questions for Lewis that they want to unmute and ask? Cool, Lewis. I think, okay, yeah. Thank you, Emma. I think, the subjects we're going through here are really deep, Lewis, and on behalf of everyone at the Happiness Index and all the listeners, it's been really useful. I've learned so much. I feel like a better human being for being here and for your time. Anything that you want to sign off with, Lewis? Any final message for us?
I think, again, I don't come at this session and sort of speak from a position of absolute truth. As I say with everyone that I work with, it's an interpretation of a bigger picture. So, I hope that some points have landed and resonated and taken you into, potentially exploring different pathways where masculinity, mental health, just general sort of human experience is concerned. And I think, the work is lifelong. So, like I said, the awareness of it leaves everyone with a choice. You're aware of the ideas and the concepts, but can we push and continue that, for the entirety of our life across the different areas that, we experience life through? I think that's something that we can all take away. So I really kind of appreciative of your time and for inviting me, and I hope that it's landed and resonated with the lovely people in attendance. So thank you.
I'll just read out, Lewis, as a thank you, some of the messages. Katie Allen says, this has been excellent. Thank you so much. Matthew Hurley says, I really appreciate the session. It's been great to be able to listen in. Thanks. And great role model, Lewis. There's a question in there which we're running out of time, so I'll send you the question and then we'll get that question back to Josh Douglas. But thank you for everyone who's attended. We really appreciate it. Lewis, thank you again, and I wish everyone a great Friday evening and a good afternoon.
Thank you so much. See you guys.
Thanks, everyone.